no Urango ve Terry Sizui so gehets taman hope tam temem maha. Ha, begumiterin to a meffen. My husband's lawyer actually set down his pen. My mother-in-law, sitting across the table in her cream blazer with her perfect posture, looked at me like I had just spoken in tongues. My name is Serena. I'm 32 years old, and that Tuesday morning in a downtown Minneapolis law office was the first time in 6 years of marriage that I said exactly what I meant without softening a single syllable. My husband's name is Patrick. We met when I was 25 and he was 31 at a fundraiser gala for a children's hospital where I had helped coordinate the event through my company. He was tall, charming in that easy way that makes you think a man is confident, when really he just never learned to take anything seriously. I thought it was warmth. It took me years to understand it was indifference. At the time, I was a senior financial analyst at a mid-sized investment advisory firm in Minneapolis. I had worked my way up from a junior associate position, worked late most nights, kept meticulous spreadsheets, and genuinely loved the discipline of it. Numbers don't lie to you. They don't tell you what you want to hear. I found that comforting. Patrick worked in commercial real estate development, or at least that's how he described it. The reality, which I learned piece by piece over the following years, was that he had partial interest in 2 small development projects that his father had co-signed loans for, and what he mostly did was attend networking lunches and play golf with men who were more successful than him, hoping something would rub off. His family came from old money in the Twin Cities area, not the kind of old money that still had old money, but the kind that had the old habits, the lake house in Wisconsin, the annual donation to the symphony, the absolute certainty that their last name meant something, while quietly drowning in debt they refused to discuss. When we got engaged, my mother pulled me aside. She asked if I was sure. I told her I was. I remember the expression on her face. She didn't say anything else, but she also didn't look away fast enough for me not to see it. I was sure. I was wrong. Within a year of our wedding, I was covering our mortgage, our car payments, and half the expenses for a lake house I had never once asked for. Patrick's development projects had stalled. His father had overextended on a commercial property loan and needed help bridging the gap. That first transfer, $40,000, was framed as temporary. It always is. The list grew. His mother's knee surgery, out of pocket because their insurance had lapsed and they hadn't told anyone. His younger sister's graduate school application fees, then her first month's rent in Boston, the lake house maintenance, the HOA fees on a condo Patrick owned before we married that he'd somehow forgotten to mention was 6 months behind. I kept a spreadsheet. Old habit. I wasn't angry yet. I told myself I was investing in our future. That family means carrying each other. Our son was born in our 3rd year of marriage. We named him Theo. He had Patrick's dark hair and my eyes, and from the moment I held him, I understood what it meant to have a reason that was bigger than exhaustion. I went back to work at 10 weeks because we needed the income. My mother-in-law called it a shame. She said it in that particular way some women have, all sympathy on the surface, just enough condescension underneath to make sure you feel it. Patrick was a disengaged father from the start. Not absent in the dramatic sense. He was physically present, sitting on the couch while Theo cried, in the house while I ran the bath and read the bedtime story, and handled every school form and pediatrician appointment and early morning sickness episode. Presence without participation. I thought it would change. I kept thinking that. The first real crack came when Theo was around 18 months old. Patrick started coming home later. He said it was client dinners. He started putting his phone face down on tables. He started showering the moment he walked in the door, even on evenings he claimed he'd been at his office. I noticed each of these things separately. I filed them away. I told myself I was being paranoid. I wasn't paranoid. I found out the way people usually do, not through a dramatic confrontation, but through a small mundane detail. A charge on a credit card I managed for our household account. A restaurant I didn't recognize. Twice in 1 week. On evenings he told me he was working late. I looked the place up. It was a wine bar in St. Paul, 12 miles from his office and 6 miles from a residential neighborhood I had no reason to associate with us. I didn't say anything that night. I waited. I started paying closer attention. 3 weeks later, I left work early on a Thursday and drove to that neighborhood. I parked down the block from a small apartment complex. I sat in my car for 45 minutes before Patrick's SUV pulled into the visitor lot. He got out. He walked around to the passenger side and opened the door. A young woman stepped out, early 20s, dark ponytail, a grocery bag in each hand. He took one of the bags from her. He put his hand on the small of her back as they walked toward the building entrance. She was visibly pregnant. I drove home. I went to Theo's room and sat on the floor next to his crib and listened to him breathe for a long time. I didn't cry until later, alone in the bathroom with the water running. But I also took out my phone and took photographs, because even in that moment, maybe especially in that moment, something inside me shifted from grief into something colder and more useful. I had spent 6 years being the person who absorbed things quietly and kept the household running and never made it awkward for anyone. That version of me was done. I learned her name was Zoe, 23, a part-time student at a community college in St. Paul. I confirmed it from the intercom directory at her building, which had her last name listed. I did not stalk her. I gathered facts. There is a difference, and I needed to be the person who understood that difference. Over the next 2 weeks, I went back through our finances with a precision I had never applied to my own marriage. I pulled every bank statement going back 4 years. I cross-referenced transfers, withdrawals, and credit card charges. I built a full timeline. Patrick had been paying rent on Zoe's apartment for 11 months. A $1,200 monthly transfer routed through a holding account he thought I didn't have access to, connected to one of his stored development LLCs. He had paid for her prenatal appointments, her ultrasounds, a car repair in February, a semester of tuition the previous fall. He had transferred money to a prepaid card in her name at least 8 times in the past year. With whose money? Mine. My salary. The income I had deposited into our joint accounts because I trusted him. The household account I managed because he couldn't be bothered. The number I arrived at when I calculated every dollar I had contributed to Patrick's world, his family's debts, his failed projects, his mistress's rent, his mother's medical bills, was just over $380,000. Nearly 4 years of my salary, in significant part, gone into a life that had been lying to me the entire time. I sat with that number for 3 nights. Then I called an attorney. Her name was Laurel. She'd been recommended by a colleague at work who said she was the kind of family law attorney you wanted if the other side had something to lose. I brought my laptop to her office and opened a spreadsheet on the conference table between us. She looked at the figures for a while without speaking. Then she said, "You have documentation for all of this." I nodded. Bank statements, transfer receipts, email acknowledgements from Patrick when I'd transferred money he'd asked for, text messages where his mother had asked me directly for funds. "Serena," Laurel said, "you're not just getting divorced. You have grounds for a significant asset recovery claim." I exhaled for what felt like the first time in weeks. We discussed custody. Theo was 3 years old. I was the primary caregiver by every measurable standard. I handled every school and medical record. My income was stable. Patrick had no consistent income and, it was now clear, had been financially irresponsible in documented ways. But Laurel warned me. Patrick's family had resources left, not much, but enough to hire a reasonable attorney and make things ugly. They would argue about the environment, the family home, the grandparents, the stability of a 2-parent arrangement. "Are you ready for a fight?" she asked. I thought about Theo. The way he called for me at night. The way he'd asked where Daddy was going when Patrick came home late again and couldn't answer with anything real. The way a 3-year-old absorbs the emotional temperature of a home without being able to name what he's feeling. "Yes," I said. We didn't file anything immediately. I spent 2 more weeks organizing. I went through every shared account and moved my personal savings to an account in my name only. Something I should have done years before. I documented Theo's medical appointments, his school records, every parent-teacher note, every emergency room visit. I wasn't building a case against Patrick as a person. I was simply recording the truth of who had been there. My mother-in-law called me the following Friday morning, her voice warm in that deliberate way. "Serena, we'd love to have you and Theo over for Sunday dinner. I feel like we haven't really talked in months." I told her I'd come. I wanted to see what they were planning. The Sunday dinner was the whole family, Patrick at the head of the table. His father, who'd recently had a minor cardiac event and looked like he knew it. His mother, in her usual position of orchestrating every conversation. His older brother and his wife, who I'd always liked more than the rest of them and who sat across from me with an expression I couldn't read. Patrick's mother started before the food was even fully on the table. She said she was worried about Theo's stability, that children needed consistency, that she understood things were difficult between Patrick and me, but that Theo's needs had to come first, and given my work schedule and demands of my career. Who pays for his daycare? I asked. She stopped. Who handled his health insurance enrollment? Who took him to his 18-month checkup, his 2-year well visit, his last ear infection? Who knows what foods he has reactions to? No one answered. Patrick said, "This doesn't have to be hostile." I agree, I said. I reached into the bag I'd set beside my chair and placed a folder on the table. Inside were printed copies of our financial timeline, 4 years of transfers, the LLC routing, the rent payments to Zoe's apartment building. So let's not be hostile. Let's just be honest. Patrick's mother picked up the top sheet. Her face changed. His father said, "Where did you get these?" "I managed our household finances for 6 years," I said. "I've always had these." Patrick stood up from his chair. "Serena, sit down." My own voice surprised me. Calm. Like I was in the client meeting. "I am not here to fight tonight. I'm here so that everyone in this room understands what the actual situation is before any attorney has a conversation about my son." Patrick's brother looked at his wife. She was staring at the table. I laid out 3 things clearly. First, I was filing for divorce and would be requesting sole physical and legal custody of Theo. Second, I was pursuing a legal claim to recover documented financial contributions I had made to Patrick's family and to his business interests over the course of our marriage. Third, I was not going to be contributing to this family's expenses in any form going forward, effective immediately. Patrick's mother found her voice. "You can't take Theo away from his grandparents." "I'm not taking him from his grandparents," I said. "I'm making sure he has at least one parent who can provide a stable home. That parent is me." I picked up my bag and left. Patrick followed me to the front door. He said my name. I turned around. "You're really going to do this?" he asked. He looked genuinely confused, the way someone looks when they've overestimated their own leverage for so long that reality comes as a surprise. "You've been paying another woman's rent with my money while I covered your family's debts," I said. "What exactly did you think was going to happen?" He didn't have an answer. He never did. I learned more about Zoe 2 weeks later, not from surveillance but from a phone call I wasn't expecting. Her name came up on my screen as an unknown number on a Tuesday afternoon while I was eating lunch at my desk. I almost didn't answer. Her voice was quiet and careful. She said she'd found my number through a mutual contact, someone who knew Patrick from his development circles, who apparently felt guilty enough about what he knew to pass along information to both of us. She said she needed to tell me something. We met at a coffee shop near the St. Louis Paul waterfront. I got there first and watched her walk in. She was younger than I'd expected somehow, even knowing her age. She sat down and immediately said, "I'm sorry, I didn't know the full truth until 4 months in." I told her to tell me what she came to tell me. She said Patrick had told her they were separated, that we had a co-parenting arrangement, that I had moved on with someone else. She said she believed him because he was attentive at first, always available, always there with a solution when she needed something. She'd been in the city alone, working and trying to finish school. He had felt like stability. "And now?" I asked. She looked down at the table. 2 weeks ago he told me his finances were getting complicated. He said he needed to reduce what he was sending me. I asked what that meant. He said once the baby was born, he'd figure out the legal side of things, but that I shouldn't expect anything formal in writing. She paused. He also told his mother about the baby. She called me. "What did she say?" Zoe's jaw tightened. She said that the child would be a welcome addition to the family if paternity was confirmed, but that I shouldn't have any expectations about my own position, that I was not the kind of person they'd want associated with their family's name in any official way. I looked at her across the table. Different circumstances, same woman receiving the same message. You are useful until you aren't. "What do you want?" I asked. "I want to stop being afraid," she said. "I have nothing. If he stops sending money, I can't make rent in 30 days. I'm 7 months pregnant and I have no backup plan. I asked her if she had documentation, text messages, transfers, anything that established what Patrick had been paying and for how long. She had everything. She showed me on her phone. She had screenshots going back almost a year. Money requests, his confirmations, messages where he had explicitly told her not to worry, that he would take care of things, that his finances were solid. I told her I wasn't there to be her friend, and I wasn't going to pretend the past year hadn't happened. But I told her I also wasn't going to let the same man discard 2 women and walk away without consequence. She forwarded me every document she had. I gave Laurel the new materials that evening. She was quiet for a long time after I finished explaining. Then she said, "Serena, this is no longer just a divorce proceeding. The financial routing through his LLC accounts, if he was using business entities to funnel personal expenses and reporting them differently, we may be looking at fraudulent financial transfers, and his family's involvement in managing the narrative around the pregnancy could become relevant." I absorbed that. What do I need to do? "Keep doing exactly what you're doing," she said. "And be prepared for him to get desperate." She was right about that. The first sign came 2 days later. My company's HR department calls me in for a meeting. Someone had submitted an anonymous complaint to the executive board alleging that I had a conflict of interest in my role, specifically that I had used my position in financial analysis to help a client-adjacent entity, referencing Patrick's Development LLC by name. I sat in that meeting with the HR director and our general counsel, and I was grateful, not for the first time, for my own obsessive record-keeping. I had never had signing authority over Patrick's LLC. I had helped informally with spreadsheets as a spouse, the same way I'd helped his mother organize her tax documents one year. I had no financial stake in his business. I laid out the timeline calmly, provided documentation, and noted that I had retained outside counsel regarding the LLC's financial irregularities before this complaint had been filed. The general counsel looked at my materials and said, "You came prepared." "I've learned to be," I said. They cleared me. The company formally noted that anonymous unsubstantiated complaints would not result in disciplinary action, and that if my name was brought into external proceedings in a way that affected the firm's reputation, they would provide support. I walked to the elevator, pressed the button, stood there while it rose, and when the doors opened, I stepped in, pressed the button for my floor, and let myself shake for approximately 45 seconds. Then the doors opened, and I walked back to my desk. That night, Patrick called. He skipped straight to it. "You cost me a business partner," he said. "Someone pulled out of a project because of rumors about the LLC accounting." "I didn't start any rumors," I said. "You showed people documents. I showed my attorney documents," I said. "What your attorney did with them is not my problem, Serena." His voice shifted. Lower. "If this goes any further, I have nothing. You know that. If my LLC gets audited, I'm done. That sounds like a consequence of your choices. Theo needs a father." "Theo has needed a lot of things for 3 years," I said. "Most of which you weren't there to provide." He went quiet. "Then, help me, just this once. Drop the asset recovery and I'll agree to your custody terms. Everything you want with Theo, I'll sign it." I had thought about this moment. I had genuinely thought about it. Whether there was any version of this where I helped. "No," I said. "Why not?" "Because this isn't the first time you've said, just this once. And because my son deserves to grow up knowing that agreements mean something and that consequences are real. I'm not going to undermine that lesson before he's old enough to learn it." Patrick hung up. 3 days later, his mother called me crying. I hadn't heard her cry before, not genuinely. She said Patrick hadn't come home the previous 2 nights. She said his father's blood pressure was dangerously high. She said the lake house had a lender's notice on it. She asked if I could please, just this once, consider what this was doing to the family. I told her I was sorry about her husband's health. I meant it. I told her I was not in a position to help financially. I also meant that. After I hung up, I sat on my kitchen floor for a while, not because I was wavering, but because there is something genuinely strange about the moment you stop being the person who absorbs other people's crises, and you have to just sit with the discomfort of not absorbing them anymore. Then Theo padded out of his room in his socks and asked if we could have cereal. Yes, I said, we can have cereal. He climbed up onto the kitchen chair and I got out the bowls and I thought, this is what I'm protecting. This specific, ordinary, irreplaceable thing. The preliminary custody hearing was scheduled for a Thursday in November. I wore a charcoal grey blazer, hairback, flat shoes. I had learned from watching enough professional settings that the way you dress signals what you believe about your own credibility. I believed in mine. Patrick's attorney opened by constructing a narrative about stability. Two-parent household, extended family nearby, grandparents willing to be involved. He painted my work schedule as a liability, VP-level demands, late hours, high-stakes client work. He used the word demanding 4 times about my career and 0 times about Patrick's. Patrick's mother testified. She was good, warm, measured, careful to say all the right things about wanting to cooperate, about loving Theo, about having no intention of excluding me from his life. She just wanted him to have a full family environment. I noticed the judge write something down when she said that. Then Laura walked through our documentation. Primary caregiver on every medical form going back 3 years. Every daycare enrollment, every school emergency contact, every pediatric appointment record. My name, my number, my signature. Financial provider. Tax returns showing my income versus Patrick's reported income, which had been minimal for the past 2 years and inconsistent for the 2 years before that. Patrick's conduct. The LLC transfers to Zoe's address. The timeline establishing a relationship of at least 12 months while we were married. The documented evidence that he had used marital funds for this purpose. And then there was the incident I hadn't known about until Laurel told me 48 hours before the hearing, 6 weeks prior, on a Saturday morning when Theo was at Patrick's parents' house for what was supposed to be a brief visit. Patrick had taken him out of state to his brother's property in Wisconsin without notifying me. He'd brought him back the same evening. Theo had mentioned it. We went on a long car ride, but I hadn't understood the significance until Laura cross-referenced the timeline and realized it had happened without any communication to me and during a period covered by our temporary co-parenting agreement. That was an unauthorized removal across state lines. When Laurel presented the documentation of the Wisconsin trip, Patrick's attorney shifted in his chair. Patrick himself looked straight ahead at the wall behind the judge. The judge asked Patrick a direct question about the trip. Patrick's attorney objected twice. The judge noted both objections and repeated the question. Patrick said it was a spontaneous family visit. He said Theo had enjoyed it. He said there had been no intent to cause concern. The judge looked at him for a moment, then wrote something down. When it was my turn to testify, I answered every question factually. I didn't cry. I didn't editorialize. I talked about Theo's routine, his needs, his world as I knew it, his allergies, his fears, his favorite books, the way he needed the hallway light on when he slept, the specific stuffed animal he couldn't fall asleep without. I talked about his pediatrician and his preschool teacher and the playdate schedule I maintained with 2 other families in our neighborhood. Patrick's attorney asked if I was attempting to alienate Theo from his father. I said, I have never prevented my son from seeing his father. I have simply been the parent who shows up. The room was quiet. We didn't get a final ruling that day. But Laura leaned over to me afterward and said, the Wisconsin documentation changed this hearing. 2 weeks after the preliminary hearing, I got a call from Zoe. She was at the hospital, not in labor, not an emergency, but a complication that had required monitoring. Patrick had been to see her once in the past 3 weeks. The last time they'd spoken, he told her that given the financial pressure, he was reconsidering his level of involvement. She told me that the hospital had run additional prenatal testing at her request. There was a reason she'd requested it. Before Patrick, she had been briefly involved with someone else. An overlap of about 3 weeks before she'd realized the relationship with Patrick was becoming serious. She said she had told herself the timing made Patrick the father, but the test results had come back with enough ambiguity in the blood typing and timeline that her doctor had recommended further confirmation. She said Patrick had found out. He had called her not to be supportive, but to tell her that if the child wasn't his, she was on her own. That he would deny everything, that anything he'd sent her was a personal gift between friends, and she couldn't prove otherwise. I sat with that for a long moment. Then I called Laurel. What followed moved faster than I expected. Patrick's denial of paternity, delivered by text message, which Zoe had screenshotted, was now part of a pattern of behavior Laurel could characterize in court. The LLC transfers, previously framed as potential fraud, were now also framed as deliberate financial manipulation tied to coercion. Patrick had, in writing, threatened a pregnant woman in a financially dependent position. The attorney for Patrick's family called Laurel and requested a meeting. It was the first time they'd requested anything. Every prior interaction had been demands. The settlement meeting was at Laurel's office on a Wednesday morning. Patrick came with his attorney. His mother did not attend, which surprised me until I realized she was probably the smarter of the two. I sat across from Patrick for the first time since I had left their family home. He looked like someone who'd been awake too many nights in a row. His shirt was pressed, but his eyes were somewhere else. The settlement terms were proposed, counted, and eventually agreed upon over 4 hours. I was granted sole legal and physical custody of Theo. Patrick was given structured visitation, scheduled, documented, and subject to review. He was ordered to pay child support calculated on a percentage of any verified income going forward. The asset recovery claim was settled with a structured payment agreement covering a documented portion of what I had contributed to his LLC and family expenses. Not the full amount, but enough that the number was real. Patrick did not look at me when we signed. His attorney gathered the papers. Laurel made notes. The meeting ended. We stood and Patrick's attorney shook Laurel's hand and they exchanged professional courtesies. Patrick and I were briefly in the same space near the conference room door. He said my name, just that, not a question, not a request. I turned to look at him. He opened his mouth and then closed it again. I know, I said, because I did. I knew what he was going to say. That it wasn't supposed to end this way. That he hadn't meant for any of it to go this far. That somewhere in the wreckage there had been something real. I know, I said again. It still happened. I walked out first. The weeks that followed were quieter than I expected. Not empty. Theo filled the apartment with noise and energy and a constant stream of questions about trains and dinosaurs and why the sky is blue and where the dogs dream. But quieter in the way a room is quiet after you've removed the hum of something you'd stopped noticing. I moved into a 2-bedroom apartment near Theo's preschool. Clean, bright, mine. I bought a used coffee table from an estate sale, and Theo helped me carry it up the stairs, very seriously gripping one corner, convinced he was providing essential structural support. My mother came to visit the second weekend. She brought soup and spent 3 hours on my kitchen floor with Theo building a very ambitious train track. My dad called from their house in Ohio and said simply, "We're proud of you." I had to put the phone down for a minute after that. Patrick kept to the visitation schedule some weeks and not others. His parents saw Theo occasionally with my knowledge and my conditions. I did not prevent it, but I also did not enable it. There is a version of forgiveness that is less about warmth and more about releasing the weight of someone else's failures. I was working toward that version. 3 months after the custody order was finalized, I got a letter from Zoe. Not a text, an actual letter handwritten on stationery with her return address in St. Paul. She'd had her daughter. She said the paternity question had been resolved. The child was not Patrick's. She had reached out to the baby's biological father, who had responded better than she expected. She was taking things one step at a time. At the end of the letter she wrote, "I know I have no right to ask you for anything, but I want you to know that the way you handled everything, the way you were honest with me even when you had every reason not to be. I've thought about it a lot. I'm trying to be more like that, that's all." I read it twice, then I folded it and put it in the drawer of my nightstand, not to save it for anything, just because it felt like something that should be kept. On a Saturday in early spring, I took Theo to a farmer's market near the river. He ate half a strawberry sample, declared it pretty good, and then became completely absorbed by a vendor who was selling small succulent plants. He wanted the one that looked, in his words, like a tiny tree. I bought it for him. We walked back to the car with the succulent in Theo's arms, him narrating everything he planned to do to care for it. Water it, but not too much, because the man said that, and put it in the window, and maybe name it. "What are you going to name it?" I asked. He thought very hard for about half a block. "Gerald," he said. "Good name," I said. He lit up at me with total seriousness. "Mom, Gerald is going to be fine." I laughed out loud in a way I hadn't in a long time. The unguarded kind that doesn't announce itself. He laughed too, not sure what was funny but happy to be in it. There are people who will ask if I regret how things went. If I regret not being quieter, not finding some way to hold things together. If I regret the money, the years, the version of the future I thought I was building. I don't. Because the version I was building wasn't real. It was a structure I was funding with my own labor and my own silence, and it would have kept requiring both for as long as I was willing to provide them. The day I told that conference room that if they wanted my son, they could pay for him themselves. That wasn't a moment of rage. It was the moment I stopped pretending that sacrifice without limits was the same thing as love. It isn't. I know that now. And I know it not because I read it somewhere or because someone told me. I know it because I lived on the other side of it for 6 years, and I know what it costs, and I know what it costs you in ways that don't show up in any spreadsheet. Theo is 4 now. He is opinionated about breakfast food and very committed to Gerald. He asks me sometimes if we're going to stay in our apartment forever. I tell him I don't know, that we might move somewhere with a yard someday. With a garden? He asks. Maybe with a garden, he asks. Maybe with a garden, I say. He considers this. Gerald would like a garden. I think Gerald would love a garden, I say. He nods, satisfied, and goes back to whatever he was doing. That's enough. That is, genuinely and completely, enough. There's a version of this story where I stayed quiet, where I transferred the next $40,000, smiled at Sunday dinners, and told myself that keeping the peace was the same thing as keeping my family together. I almost lived that version. For 6 years, I came very close. What stopped me wasn't a single dramatic moment. It was a spreadsheet. I know that sounds absurd, that a woman's turning point was a financial document she built at her kitchen table at 11 o'clock on a Tuesday night. But that spreadsheet was the first time I looked to my own life with honesty instead of hope. $380,000. Years of my work, my discipline, my mornings and late nights, funneled into a household that had decided, without ever saying it out loud, that I existed to fill the gaps they created. What I've come to understand since then is that the consequences Patrick faced were not something I did to him. They were the accumulated weight of every choice he made and refused to account for. He chose the deception. He chose the financial manipulation. He chose to take Theo across state lines without telling me, as if the rules that applied to everyone else were optional for him. People like that don't collapse because someone finally fights back. They collapse because reality was always going to catch up. They had just found someone willing to stand between them and it for as long as possible. I stopped standing there. That's all. The harder thing to talk about is what it cost me to get there. Not the money. I've made peace with the money. The harder cost was the years I spent being reasonable when I should have been honest. Staying accommodating when I should have asked harder questions. I was smart enough to build a career that supported an entire extended family, but for a long time I wasn't willing to apply that same clear-eyed thinking to the people I was building it for. That gap between what I could see professionally and what I refused to see personally is where the real damage lived. Theo is 4 now, and he named his succulent Gerald, and he is the most serious person I know on the subject of proper watering schedules. He doesn't know the full story of what happened with his father, and he won't for a long time. What he does know is that our apartment is calm. That I come home, that when he wakes up at night, I'm there. Children register safety in their bodies before they can name it. I think he feels safe. I know I do, for the first time in years. If there's anything I'd say to someone standing where I stood, spreadsheet open, trying to make the numbers make sense, not yet ready to admit what they mean, it's this. The discipline it takes to see clearly is the same discipline it takes to act on what you see. They're not separate skills. You already have both. The only question is whether you're willing to turn them toward your own life. I was, eventually, and it cost me less than staying would have.